There is a silence that exists only in waiting rooms. It is not the silence of a library or a church or a field after snowfall. It is the silence of men who have stopped explaining themselves to people who are never going to understand anyway. The silence of waiting for a number to be called, for a name, for something that may or may not arrive. Colonel Harlan Pruitt had been sitting in that silence for 47 minutes. He was 65 years old, though most people who saw him for the first time guessed higher. Not because he looked decrepit, quite the opposite. He was built like a man who had spent 4 decades doing things that required a body to be useful rather than ornamental. Wide through the shoulders, hands that looked like they had been carved from something harder than skin. But there was a weight behind his eyes that added years, the kind of weight that does not come from age. It comes from accumulation. He sat with his back against the wall the way he always sat in public spaces, a habit so ingrained he no longer noticed it. On his knee rested a composition notebook, the black and white marbled kind you can still find at a Walgreens for $2. The cover was soft with use. The pages near the front had been written on so many times in such close handwriting that the paper had taken on a slightly waxy quality, like old skin. He was writing, not typing, writing, with a pen that was running low on ink so that every few lines he had to press harder to keep the letters visible. The young woman at the intake desk, whose name tag said Loretta, had been watching him between patients for the better part of an hour. She was 26 years old and had worked at the Tucson VA for 3 years, and in that time, she had learned to read the men who came through those doors the way a good mechanic learns to read an engine, by sound, by posture, by what they do when they think no one is looking. This one was different, not in the way veterans are sometimes different, which is to say louder or angrier or more obviously broken. He was different in a quieter way, like a man who had recently made a decision that cost him something and had not yet fully reckoned with the price. When she called his name, he looked up slowly, not startled, deliberate. She smiled. "Colonel Pruitt, Dr. Navarro will see you now." He closed the notebook carefully, the way you close something that matters. He tucked it under his arm. "What are you writing?" she asked. She had not meant to ask. It came out before she could stop it. He looked at her for a moment, not annoyed, almost as though the question had landed somewhere it was meant to land. "The truth," he said, "about what happened at a place called Iron Ridge, and about the things I didn't do." He paused. "For 37 years. He moved toward the hallway door. "And about the morning a woman I'd never met walked into that base and made it impossible for me to keep not doing them." The door closed behind him, and Loretta was left with the fluorescent lights in the silence of the waiting room, and the feeling that she had just heard the beginning of something she would have very much liked to hear the rest of. Iron Ridge Military Installation, Pinal County, Arizona, March 2024. The sun came up the way it always does in the Arizona desert in early spring, without apology, without ceremony. One moment the sky was the color of ash, and the next it was the color of fire, and the transition between the two was so fast and so complete that it felt less like a sunrise and more like a verdict. By 5:40 in the morning, the parade ground at Iron Ridge was already beginning to move. Iron Ridge was what people in the military call a joint installation, which is a polite way of saying it was a place where 2 different branches of the service had been required to share space without being required to particularly like each other. The Army used the eastern side for training rotations. The Navy used the western side for logistics operations and what the official paperwork called special skills assessment, a phrase that could mean almost anything and usually meant something the paperwork was not going to describe in detail. The base sat roughly 60 miles southeast of Phoenix at an elevation that kept it slightly cooler than the city in summer and significantly colder than civilians expected in winter. The surrounding terrain was high desert, scrub brush and red rock, and the occasional saguaro cactus standing at the edge of the hardpan like it was waiting for something. The air smelled of dust and creosote, and near the western motor pool the ever-present ghost of diesel fuel. It was not a beautiful place, but it was a real place. The kind where things that matter actually happen, as opposed to the places where people talk about things mattering. Harlan Pruitt had commanded Iron Ridge for 14 months. He had not asked for the assignment. At 64, with 43 years of service behind him and a retirement packet sitting in a drawer at home in Tucson that he kept telling himself he was going to submit, he had expected his final posting to be something administrative, something in an office building in San Antonio or Norfolk, where the most demanding part of his day would be reviewing requisition forms and arguing with contractors. He had not expected Iron Ridge, But Iron Ridge had a problem, and the people above Pruitt had decided that Pruitt was the kind of man who could fix it. The problem had a name: Sergeant Victor Holt. Holt was 39 years old, 6 feet 3 inches tall, and built like something assembled from spare parts left over from a larger project. He had been at Iron Ridge for 2.5 years, and in that time, he had established himself as the kind of presence that organizations develop when the structure meant to contain such presences is either too weak or too compromised to function properly. He was loud in the way certain men are loud, not because they have something to say, but because volume has always worked for them as a substitute for substance. He was physically imposing in a way he used deliberately and often, and he had over 27 months constructed around himself a small ecosystem of loyalty based entirely on fear. 3 or 4 men on the enlisted side of Iron Ridge treated Holt the way medieval villagers treated the local warlord. They laughed at his jokes. They disappeared when he asked for privacy. They confirmed whatever version of events he preferred when it reached the chain of command. Pruitt knew about all of it. The 2 soldiers who had requested transfers in the last 8 months, rather than explain why they needed to leave. The mechanic from Bakersfield named Torres, who had filed a complaint in January, and then 6 days later withdrawn it without explanation. The junior officer, a 23-year-old lieutenant named Okafor, who had shown up to a morning formation with a bruise along his jaw that he attributed to a training accident, and whom no one, including Pruitt, had pressed to say otherwise. Pruitt knew, and knowing he had done very little. Not nothing. He had documented, he had filed internal memos. He had requested meetings with Major Glenn Stoker, the second-ranking officer at Iron Ridge, whose job it technically was to manage personnel issues at the NCO level. Those meetings had produced the military equivalent of fog, procedures, timelines, suggestions that things were more complicated than they appeared. Stoker was 48 years old and had a gift for making the uncomplicated seem impossible to resolve, which is a skill that certain administrators develop, and which Pruitt had recognized immediately for what it was. He had recognized it, and he had let it happen, because he had been here before. And the last time the cost of not letting it happen had seemed too high. He was thinking about Fort Bragg when Commander Rachel Caldwell arrived. He was standing on the second-floor exterior walkway of the command building, drinking coffee from a thermos he had owned since Desert Storm, watching the parade ground come alive below him. He was thinking, as he often did in early morning, about a man named Sergeant First Class Dale Whitmore, who had stood in a motor pool at Fort Bragg in the autumn of 1987 and told Pruitt quietly behind the cover of an engine block that something was wrong in their unit, that someone with rank was doing something that was going to get people hurt. Pruitt had been 28 years old, a captain, smart enough to understand what Whitmore was telling him and experienced enough to understand what it would cost to act on it. He had thanked Whitmore. He had told him to put it in writing through official channels. He had walked away. 14 months later, a 22-year-old private named Ezra Cobb died during a training and exercise that 3 subsequent investigations described as improperly supervised. The officer responsible received a letter of reprimand and a transfer to a posting in Germany. Dale Whitmore left the Army the following year. Pruitt had not spoken to either of them again. He thought about Ezra Cobb more often than he thought about anything that had happened in Desert Storm. He was thinking about Ezra Cobb when the vehicle came through the main gate. It was a standard-issue Navy transport van, the kind that moved personnel between installations without announcement of who was being moved or why. It stopped near the base of the flagpole at 6:12 in the morning, and the side door opened and one person got out. She was not what Pruitt had expected. He had read the file such as it was. The transfer paperwork described a Commander Naval Rank 05, attachment to Iron Ridge, on a temporary assignment in a logistics support capacity. Her name was Rachel Caldwell. Her record showed 25 years of naval service, most of it unspecified or marked with classification codes that Pruitt did not have clearance to open. The photograph was 2 years old and showed a woman in dress uniform with an expression that gave away nothing. What stepped out of the transport van that morning gave away nothing either. She was 47 years old. Medium height, though something in how she moved made her seem taller. She wore standard-issue fatigues pressed, but not obsessively so, and carried a single black duffel bag over her left shoulder with the ease of someone for whom a duffel bag is the most natural object in the world. Her hair was dark, going silver at the temples in a way she had clearly made no effort to prevent. Her eyes, when they moved across the parade ground in that first slow sweep, were the color of ice over deep water. She was not scanning for threats. Pruitt had seen people scan for threats. This was different. She was simply looking. The way a person looks at a room they have inhabited before, not in memory, but in essence. the posture and the angle and the economy of movement that said, I know how spaces like this work. I have worked in spaces like this in circumstances that never appear in any file you are cleared to read. She adjusted the strap of the duffel and began walking toward the administrative building. Pruitt watched her cross 40 feet of parade ground. He took a sip of coffee. He had the distinct and unusual sensation of watching someone enter a situation that was not going to unfold the way that situation normally unfolded. He did not yet know how right he was. Sergeant Victor Holt spotted her from across the courtyard. He was standing near the entrance to the vehicle bay talking to Corporal Danny Mace, who was technically supposed to be running a pre-operation check on a Humvee, and was instead doing what Danny Mace did most mornings, which was standing near Holt and laughing at things that were not particularly funny. Holt saw her and stopped talking mid-sentence. Mace, following his gaze, saw her too. Fresh meat, Holt said. Mace made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite agreement, but was the noise he made when performing loyalty for an audience. Holt had a particular instinct honed over years for identifying people least likely to push back. New arrivals were always candidates. Women in fatigues not accompanied by anyone ranked above them were better candidates. Someone walking alone across the parade ground at 6 in the morning with a single bag and no welcoming party was, to Holt's operating theory, precisely the kind of opportunity the morning had been put there to provide. He started walking toward her. He had covered about half the distance when she became aware of him. Pruitt, watching from the walkway, could tell the exact moment it happened. Not because she flinched or altered her course. She did not. But there was a microsecond adjustment in her posture, so small it would have been invisible to anyone who had not spent 30-plus years learning to read bodies in the field in which she registered the incoming variable and filed it. She kept walking. Holt angled to intercept her at the midpoint of the parade ground, and he did it in the way he always did things, with his shoulders forward and his chin level, and the full projection of 230 pounds of deliberately maintained physical mass. Hey, he said. He said it the way certain men say hey, not as a greeting, as a boundary marker. She looked at him. Morning, Sergeant. A perfectly neutral response. 2 words. The appropriate courtesy of rank, acknowledged, nothing more. Anyone reasonable would have taken it as the complete interaction it was intended to be and moved on. Holt was not interested in being reasonable. He stepped into her path, not beside her, into her path. You must be lost, he said. His voice was the kind cultivated for exactly this. Low enough to sound controlled, out enough to carry to the people nearby who were not looking directly but were absolutely paying attention. This base isn't a daycare for soft recruits. She looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. I'm not a recruit, she said. I'm reporting to the command building. Your first mistake, Holt said, stepping closer, is thinking that matters before I say it does. Danny Mace had followed at a respectful distance and was now standing to one side with his arms crossed, performing the role of audience. Rule 1, Holt continued. On my base, you don't move until I've sized you up. Pruitt set down his coffee. He was already moving toward the stairs before he fully decided to. The movement came from somewhere that was not exactly the present. It came from the part of him that had spent 37 years trying to calculate exactly this moment, exactly how far to let something go, exactly when the cost of not acting finally exceeded the cost of acting. He was halfway down the stairs when Holt made his mistake. Later, the men and women who were present on the parade ground that morning would describe what happened in different ways. Some of them got the sequence wrong. Some of them missed the first part because they were not looking at exactly the right moment. A few of them would describe it in hushed tones in the mess hall and the barracks over the following days in terms that made it sound like something from a film, which is how human beings process things their direct experience has not prepared them for. What actually happened was this. Holt reached out and put his hand on her arm. Not a grab exactly, more than a touch. The kind of physical contact that is not assault in any precise legal definition, but is absolutely an exercise of dominance. The kind of thing that says, I can do this and you cannot stop me. He was wrong. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. She did not raise her voice. She did not change her expression. There was no visible anger, no visible fear, no visible anything except a sudden and absolute economy of motion that was unlike anything Pruitt had ever seen outside of a controlled training environment, and he had seen a great deal in those environments. Her right foot planted, her left shoulder dropped and rotated in the same instant. Holt's hand, which had been on her arm, suddenly had nothing to hold because her arm was no longer where it had been, and the redirected momentum of his own grip became the beginning of a sequence he had no ability to interrupt. Her right hand found his elbow. Her hip moved. The geometry of it was almost elegant. 230 pounds of Victor Holt left the ground. He hit the packed dirt of the parade ground on his back with a sound that was not loud but was very solid. The sound of mass meeting earth without the benefit of anticipation or preparation. The air came out of him in a single compressed burst. He lay there. For a moment, no one on the parade ground made any sound at all. Danny Mace had taken 2 involuntary steps backward. She stood exactly where she had been standing. Her fatigues were not disarranged. Her breathing was not audibly elevated. She looked down at Holt with an expression that was not triumph and was not contempt. It was the expression of a person watching the natural conclusion of an equation they had solved some time before it was presented to them. What, Holt said, he was gasping slightly, which is what happens when 230 pounds of body impacts the ground without the lungs being prepared for it. What the hell? She reached into the duffel bag. She removed a badge case. Matte black, the kind that does not advertise itself. She set it on his chest with the care you might use to set a glass of water on a table. Holt picked it up with hands that were not entirely steady. He opened it. The color left his face. It left the way color leaves a photograph left too long in the sun, gradually and then completely. Inside the badge case was a credential that most of the men and women at Iron Ridge would encounter exactly once in their careers if they encountered it at all. The insignia of SEAL Team Valor Black Operations Division. And below it, in the cold and specific language of the United States military, the name and rank of the person to whom it belonged. Commander Rachel Caldwell, 25 years active service. Holt said nothing. She picked up her duffel from where it had come to rest on the ground. She adjusted the strap. She looked at the men and women standing around the parade ground, not all of whom had stopped pretending to do other things. "You assaulted a superior officer," she said. She was not speaking only to Holt. She was speaking to the space. "That was your first mistake." She paused. "Your second was assuming you knew what you were dealing with." She walked past him toward the administrative building. Her footsteps were even. Her pace was the same as it had been before any of it happened. Holt lay on the ground for another moment. Then he rolled to one side and pushed himself up, clutching his shoulder, which had taken the brunt of the impact, and which Pruitt would later learn turn out to have a partial dislocation that the medical wing would spend the better part of the morning addressing. Pruitt stood at the edge of the parade ground and watched her go. He had been in the military for 43 years. He had seen things in Desert Storm that still visited him occasionally in the early hours of the morning when his defenses were low. He had seen men do remarkable things under pressure, and he had seen men do terrible things under the same pressure, and he had developed over decades a fairly calibrated sense of what another person was made of. He could not remember the last time he had seen anything like what he had just seen. Not because of the technique. The technique was extraordinary, but technique could be taught. What could not be taught was what had been underneath it. The absolute stillness of someone who had been in situations so much more dangerous than this one, that this one had not actually registered as a threat. She had not been managing the situation. She had simply been present in it in a way that made the situation irrelevant to her equilibrium. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he picked up the radio from his belt and said quietly to the staff sergeant monitoring the command building, "Tell Commander Caldwell that Colonel Pruitt will see her in his office at 0700. Then he looked at the patch of disturbed dirt where Victor Holt had spent his 4 seconds on the ground, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Something adjacent to hope. Her file, the parts he could open, told him the following. Rachel Ann Caldwell, born Flagstaff, Arizona, 47 years old, enlisted in the Navy at 19, selected for officer candidate school at 22, SEAL qualification achieved through the combat swimmer program at 24, assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command, subsequent service record, largely redacted, replaced with classification codes that are not common and are not requested in normal circumstances. The awards and commendations visible in her file were not nothing. 2 Bronze Stars, a Navy Cross, a commendation from a joint command that was itself classified at a level Pruitt's clearance did not reach. The Navy Cross alone would have placed her in a category occupied by a very small number of people in the history of the American military. The call sign was not in the file. He had heard it from Captain Declan Waverly, who had mentioned it while discussing new personnel in the careful tone of someone sharing information they thought the receiving party deserved to have. Ghost. Pruitt had not asked where Waverly heard it. He had simply filed it. She arrived at his office at exactly 0700. She knocked once with the back of 2 knuckles. A sound neither tentative nor aggressive. precise. Come in. She entered and closed the door behind her and stood in the approximate position of a person respecting the convention of reporting to a senior officer, while simultaneously making clear through the quality of her stillness that conventions are things she has a reasoned relationship with rather than an automatic one. Pruitt stood because his father had raised him to stand when someone like this entered a room. "Commander Caldwell," he said. "Colonel Pruitt." Her voice was even, not warm, not cold. The temperature of a room that has been maintained at a consistent setting for a long time. "Sit down, please." She sat. She set the duffel on the floor beside her chair and folded her hands on the desk and waited. Pruitt sat as well. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back without discomfort. "How much trouble am I in?" she asked. "With me, none." He paused. Holt put his hands on a superior officer. "The witnesses will confirm that. The liability is entirely his." "And with Stoker?" Pruitt was quiet for a beat. He had not mentioned Stoker. The fact that she led with his name told him she had done her preparation. "That," he said, "is a more complicated question." She nodded once. The nod of someone confirming information they had already suspected. "I was told this was a logistics assignment." "It is, on paper." "Then off paper." Pruitt looked out the window at the parade ground, now fully in motion with the morning's activity, the event of an hour ago having been absorbed into the operational rhythm of the day, with the efficiency that military environments develop for absorbing unusual things. "Off paper," he said, "you've been here 6 hours and you've already done something I've been trying to do for 8 months." She did not respond to that. She did not appear to need to. "You're going to have enemies here," he said. "I'm used to enemies," she said. "I'm less used to having them on my own side of the fence." Pruitt said nothing. There was nothing to say to that which would have been both accurate and comfortable. She stood to leave. At the door she paused. "Colonel," she said, "thank you for not making this harder than it needed to be." He nodded. "Welcome to Iron Ridge, Commander." She left. He sat with the empty office for a moment. Then he opened the desk drawer and looked at the retirement packet, the one he had been telling himself for 8 months he was going to submit. He thought about Ezra Cobb. He thought about Dale Whitmore walking into a motor pool at Fort Bragg and choosing to tell someone the truth about what he had seen. He closed the drawer. By noon, Iron Ridge had processed the morning's event in the way that military installations process things, which is to say with complete informational efficiency and official silence existing simultaneously. Everyone knew. No one was saying so within earshot of rank. By the time the mess hall opened for the midday meal, the story had been told 17 different ways to an audience that had been growing all morning. Holt was in the medical wing. The information that the woman who put him there carried a Navy Cross and 25 years of service had spread with the velocity that accurate information always travels in environments where inaccurate information normally dominates. The atmosphere of the base had shifted in a way that was not large but was perceptible. The way a room changes when a window is opened. Not dramatically, but the air moves differently. In Major Glenn Stoker's office, the atmosphere had not shifted in any positive direction. Stoker was 48 years old and had the look of a man who had once been physically imposing and had gradually translated that imposingness into something more administrative. He was not fat, but he had the bearing of a person whose body had decided its primary function was now to house a mind that was working on something constantly. His eyes were pale blue and they moved with a calculation that most people interpreted as analytical intelligence, which it was, but not in service of the purposes they assumed. He had been on the phone since 7:30. The first call was to the hospital wing for a medical status on Holt. The second was to a number not stored in his official contact directory. When Pruitt arrived at Stoker's office at 1300 hours, Stoker was seated behind his desk with the posture of a man who had decided in advance how the conversation was going to go. "Holt's an idiot," was the first thing Stoker said. "Yes," said Pruitt, "but she put her hands on an enlisted man." He put his hands on her first, in front of witnesses. Witnesses in his unit. Witnesses of a dozen different designations who were on that parade ground for a dozen different reasons. Stoker folded his hands on the desk. He had the stillness that certain administrators develop the ability to appear reasonable while being immovable. There are procedures, Harlan, for a complaint of physical altercation at the NCO level. This wasn't a complaint of physical altercation, Glenn. The way Holt tells it, the way the parade ground tells it is more relevant. The way the parade ground tells it, Stoker said carefully, is one version. And before we take that version to any kind of formal process, I think we want to be careful. Caldwell is a new arrival. We don't know her. We don't know what she was instructed to do, or by whom. Until we do, I think the appropriate thing is to take a breath. Pruitt looked at him. He had been looking at Glenn Stoker for 14 months, and he had been making himself not see what he was seeing. He had been doing what he had done at Fort Bragg in 1987, which is what experienced institutions teach experienced men, that the system has processes, and the processes exist for reasons, and an individual acting on individual judgment against those processes is almost always making things worse. He had believed that for a very long time. He was beginning to wonder if he had believed it because it was true or because it was convenient. "I'll keep it in mind," he said. He left Stoker's office and walked back to his own, and he stood at the window and looked at the parade ground and thought about a 22-year-old private named Ezra Cobb, and about how convenient it is to believe that the system will handle things, and about how Ezra Cobb was not alive to evaluate how well that had worked. That evening, Pruitt went to the base gym at 1900 hours, not particularly to work out. The gym was the one place on Iron Ridge where the informal social architecture of the base allowed people to talk across ranks they would not normally talk across, and because there was something he needed to think through in the presence of physical effort. Captain Declan Waverly was already there. Waverly was 40 years old and had the lean, unhurried physicality of a man whose profession required him to remain still for very long periods, and then be entirely precise at the moment that mattered. He was a sniper, one of the best currently serving in his designation, and he had the quality of attention that people in his specialty develop. He had learned that what is visible is only the first layer of what is actually there. He saw things clearly. He did not pretend otherwise. "Hell of a morning," Waverly said, not looking up from the weight he was adjusting. "That's one way to put it," Pruitt said. Waverly looked up. He had a face you could not read easily unless you had been looking at it long enough to know what the changes in it meant. "She's the real thing," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," said Pruitt. "Stoker's going to move against her." Also not a question. "Yes," said Pruitt again. Waverly set down the weight. "She came here for a reason that isn't on the transfer orders. That much is obvious. What I don't know is whether she understands what she walked into." "I think," Pruitt said slowly, "that she has a general idea." "And Holt is a symptom. He's not the disease." Waverly nodded. He had clearly already arrived at this conclusion. "The question is how far up the disease goes." Before Pruitt could answer, the alarm system emitted two sharp tones, and then a voice came over the base-wide speaker in the clipped, compressed language of someone reporting something they would rather not be reporting. "All personnel, disturbance at the motor pool. Senior staff report immediately." Pruitt and Waverly looked at each other. They left at the same time. The motor pool was on the western edge of the installation adjacent to the fuel storage area. By the time Pruitt arrived, there were 14 people there, and the situation was not ambiguous. Holt had left the medical wing against the recommendation of the attending corpsman. His shoulder was in a soft brace. His eyes had the quality of someone who had replaced a specific kind of pain with a more general and more dangerous kind of fuel. He was standing near a vehicle bay shouting at a mechanic named Garrett, a 28-year-old from outside Boise, who was being very still, because stillness was the only thing between him and something worse. The stated accusation was that Garrett had sabotaged a vehicle. It was the kind of accusation that collapses immediately under reasonable examination, but is useful for creating chaos in the short term, and chaos in Holt's experience had always been a useful cover. Caldwell was already there. She had arrived before Pruitt. She stood at the edge of the gathering, not centered, not projecting herself into the situation, but positioned in the way of someone monitoring a space and calculating the vectors of it. Her hands were at her sides. Holt saw her. The shift in him was immediate and visible. Everything else he had been performing disappeared. What replaced it was something purer and uglier. "You think," he said, his voice scraped of its calculated social performance reduced to something raw, "you can walk in here and do what you did and just walk around like you own something." She didn't answer immediately. She looked at him with the expression of someone watching a pressure system develop, calculating its trajectory. "You ended my career," he said. "Everything I built here, Sergeant Holt." Her voice was quiet enough that the people on the edge of the crowd had to stop moving to hear it. "You need to stand down, now." He laughed, not a good laugh, the laugh of someone who has processed something painful and converted it into something kinetic. "Or what?" he said. "You going to flip me again?" In front of everyone? Waverly had positioned himself at an angle to Holt, not behind him, to the side. prepared to intervene if necessary but allowing the situation to develop according to its own logic first. Pruitt made eye contact with Waverly across the space. Waverly tilted his head slightly. "Your call." Caldwell raised one hand, palm out in Waverly's direction. A small gesture. Not dramatic. The gesture of someone who has already made a decision and needs no confirmation of it. She could handle this. "You have two options," she said to Holt. The same tone of voice you might use to tell someone the weather. "You can stop right now and we deal with this through proper channels in the morning. Or you can continue and I will end this in a way that is going to be much more difficult for you than this morning was." Holt charged. It was not elegant. It was the charge of someone who has replaced strategy with velocity. He was big and he was angry, and he was moving at a speed that would have been sufficient against most people in most situations. She moved left 2 steps. Just 2. Precise. She let his momentum carry him past her, and she used it, and the 3 strikes she landed in the following 2 seconds were not large and not theatrical, but they were exactly placed. His wrist, his knee, his solar plexus. He went down. Differently from how he had gone down in the morning, with less drama and more finality. He lay on the concrete of the motor pool and did not immediately get up, and this time when he looked up at her, something in his face had changed. Something had been reached that the morning had not quite reached. The place past performance where there is nothing left but the actual situation. Waverly moved. He crouched beside Holt and put a hand on his shoulder and said in the tone of someone who means exactly what they are saying, "That's enough." And it was. Caldwell looked at the people gathered around the motor pool. There were 19 of them by now, different ranks, different branches, different relationships to what had just happened. Some of them had worked under Holt for months. Some of them had been afraid of him. Some of them had done things they were not proud of because it had seemed easier than the alternative. She looked at all of them. "Respect," she said, "is not something that rank gives you. It is something that behavior earns. From everyone. Regardless of who is watching." She picked up her duffel, which she had set against the wall when she arrived. She walked out of the motor pool. Pruitt watched her go. He was aware of the sound of his own breathing and the distant sound of the night desert dry and enormous, the sound of a great deal of empty space being moved through by a small amount of wind. He was 65 years old, 43 years in the United States military. He had fought in a war and outlasted dozens of postings and survived the accumulation of small moral failures that careers like his tend to accrue without fanfare or formal accounting. He had spent 37 years telling himself he was the kind of man who understood how things worked. Standing in the motor pool with the shape of Holt's defeat still present in the concrete, and 20 people recalibrating something about the world around them, he was beginning to understand that there is a difference between knowing how things work and knowing what to do with that knowledge. Ezra Cobb had been 22 years old. He would have been 58 now, maybe with grandchildren. Maybe in a house somewhere in the middle of the country with a garden and a truck and a life that had not been cut short by a training accident that did not have to happen. Pruitt looked at the patch of motor pool floor where Holt had decided for the second time in one day that his certainty about the world was something the world was obligated to confirm. And he made in the quiet of that moment a decision. Not a declaration, just a small internal turning, the kind that happens when a man has been facing one direction for a very long time and something finally makes him turn. He was going to stop being careful. He didn't know yet what that was going to cost him. He suspected it was going to cost something considerable. He picked up his radio. "This is Colonel Pruitt," he said. "I want a full status report on the Holt incident on my desk by 0600, and I want someone to find out where Major Stoker is tonight." He clipped the radio back to his belt. He walked back toward the command building through the desert night, under a sky dense with stars that are only visible when you are far enough from the lights of places where people have gathered to convince themselves that they have enough light already. Iron Ridge was quiet. Tomorrow it would not be. He walked in the silence thinking about a woman who had arrived with one bag and no ceremony and had done in one day what he had failed to do in 8 months. Not through luck, not through anger, through the absolute refusal to pretend that what was wrong was not wrong. He thought about what it had taken to produce a person like that. He thought about what it cost her to carry what she was carrying. And somewhere in the dark stretch between the motor pool and the command building, with the Arizona desert laid out around him in all directions, and the stars doing what stars do, regardless of what is happening beneath them, he thought for the first time in a very long time about what it might feel like to be on the right side of something. Not the careful side, the right side. He was 65 years old. He opened the desk drawer when he returned to his office. He looked at the retirement packet. He picked it up, held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the thing, and then set it back. He wrote 2 words across the top in his compressed practice script. Not yet. He closed the drawer. There was work to do first. Real work. The kind that leaves something behind when it is finished. He sat down at his desk and began. The morning after the motor pool, Iron Ridge woke up differently. Not dramatically differently. Military installations do not wake up dramatically. They wake up on schedule with the same formations and the same flag and the same sequence of sounds that mark the transition from night to operational day. But there is a quality to the atmosphere of a place after something significant has happened that is distinct from the quality of the atmosphere before it, and people who live in close quarters with each other for long periods of time develop a sensitivity to that quality that is almost physical, like a change in barometric pressure. You feel it before you can articulate it. What Iron Ridge felt like on the morning after was a base that was waiting to see what happened next. Harlan Pruitt felt it when he walked from his quarters to the command building at 5:50 in the morning. He felt it in the way the 2 soldiers he passed near the flagpole held themselves. Not at attention, because that would have required a reason, but with a quality of attention in their posture that said they were tracking something they could not yet see clearly. He felt it in the way the sergeant at the front desk of the command building, a woman named Perkins, who had worked at Iron Ridge longer than Pruitt, had looked up at him when he entered, and then went back to her screen with the expression of someone who has decided to let the situation develop before committing to any position on it. He felt it most clearly in the status report that was sitting on his desk when he arrived. It was thorough. 6 pages. Incident chronology, witness statements, medical notation from the hospital wing regarding Holt's injuries, which included the partial dislocation from the morning's first event, and 2 additional contusions from the motor pool, all consistent with what Pruitt had observed. The report had been compiled by a young staff officer named Reyes, who had the particular quality of someone trying very hard to be accurate in a situation where accuracy might be inconvenient for certain people. The last page of the report included a notation that Pruitt read twice. At 2200 hours the previous evening, Major Glenn Stoker had filed a formal request for an administrative review of the incidents involving Commander Caldwell, citing concern regarding use of force protocols for officers and logistics assignments. The request had been routed through the base legal office and was scheduled to be presented in a preliminary hearing format the following afternoon. Pruitt set the report down. He sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Waverly. The preliminary hearing was held at 1400 hours in Conference Room B of the administrative building, which was a room that had been designed for briefings and had never been entirely comfortable for any other purpose. Fluorescent lights, a rectangular table that was slightly too large for the space, chairs that were the specific kind of uncomfortable that institutional furniture achieves not through any particular design failure, but simply through accumulated use. Stoker arrived first. He was wearing his service uniform, which was not required for an administrative hearing at this level, and the choice was deliberate in the way that all of Stoker's choices were deliberate. He sat at the head of the table, which was also not technically his position to occupy, and arranged the papers in front of him with the care of someone setting a table for a meal they had been planning for some time. Pruitt arrived with Caldwell and Waverly. He had told Caldwell about the hearing at 0700 that morning in his office, in the same direct and unemotional way he tried to tell people things that they needed to know without embellishment. She had listened without interruption and then asked one question. Not whether the hearing was fair, not whether she was going to be in trouble. She asked what Stoker's relationship with Holt was and how long it had been going on. Pruitt had told her what he knew, which was that Stoker had transferred to Iron Ridge from a posting in Colorado 18 months before Pruitt arrived, and that Holt had been at the base for 2.5 years, and that the pattern of protected behavior that Pruitt had been unable to address since his arrival had predated him by at least a year. She had nodded once, like someone fitting a piece into a structure they had been building in their mind. Now she sat at the conference table with her hands folded and her expression containing approximately the same amount of readable information as a blank page. Stoker opened the hearing with the careful language of a man who has thought about every word in advance. He expressed concern. He expressed procedural respect. He used phrases like "in the interest of fairness to all parties" and "ensuring command climate remains consistent with established standards." He was smooth in the specific way that people become smooth when they have practiced smoothness for long enough that it is no longer something they do, but something they are. He presented 3 points. The first was that Commander Caldwell's assignment to Iron Ridge was a logistics support role, not a combat or enforcement role, and that any use of physical force by someone in that role required justification under specific protocols. The second was that the incidents of the previous day, while he understood they were presented as defensive responses, had nonetheless resulted in injury to an enlisted soldier and disruption to base operations. The third was that pending a full review, he was recommending that Caldwell's movement on the installation be restricted to her assigned work areas until the administrative process was complete. He set down his papers and looked at Caldwell. She looked back at him. There was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which in a room that size and in that context was a silence of some weight. "Major Stoker," she said. Her voice had the same quality it always had, level, precise, the temperature of a room that has been at a consistent setting for a long time. "In your administrative review request, you cited use of force protocols for logistics personnel. I'd like to know which specific protocol you believe was violated." Stoker smiled the smile of a man who has anticipated this. "The question isn't necessarily which protocol was violated. It's whether the response was proportionate to the provocation. That's what the review is designed to establish." 22 witnesses observed Sergeant Holt physically grab a superior officer, Caldwell said. The response was disengagement in a single defensive throw. The subsequent motor pool incident involved a direct physical charge. These are on record. They're one version of the record. They're the version supported by 22 witness accounts. Witness accounts from personnel on this installation who are by definition in a chain of command relationship that may influence their testimony. Stoker's voice remained entirely pleasant. He had the quality of a man who can be pleasant the way a body of water can be calm. The calm tells you nothing about the depth. Pruitt watched him. He was not watching the surface of what Stoker was doing. He had stopped watching the surface of what Stoker was doing some time ago. He was watching the structure of it. The way a man who understands buildings watches a wall, not for what it looks like, but for what it is holding up. He had seen this before, not this exact configuration, but the architecture, the procedure weaponized against the person it should have been protecting. The careful, reasonable language deployed not to establish truth, but to create enough procedural fog that truth became one version among several, and several versions meant no action, and no action meant the status quo survived. He had seen it at Fort Bragg in 1987. He had failed to name it then. He had seen it in 2003 in a different configuration with different people and a different class of stakes. He had failed to name it then too. The difference between 1987 and now was Ezra Cobb. The difference between 2003 and now was that the accumulation had finally reached a weight that his silence could no longer support. "Major Stoker," Pruitt said. Everyone at the table looked at him. He had not spoken since the hearing began. "This review," he said, "is not going to result in a movement restriction for Commander Caldwell." Stoker's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The surface of the water moved. "With respect, Colonel, the review protocol gives the initiating officer the authority to—" "I'm aware of the protocol." Pruitt's voice was not raised. He had spent 36 years learning that a voice did not need to be raised to be final. "I'm also aware that the review protocol exists for situations that are genuinely unclear. This situation is not genuinely unclear. It is being made to appear unclear by someone with an interest in that appearance." He paused. "I will say that once on the record, and it will stand as my formal response to this review request." The room was quiet. Stoker looked at Pruitt for a long moment. What passed across his face was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. What passed across it was the recalibration of someone revising an assessment they had previously considered settled. "Noted," Stoker said. He gathered his papers. He stood. "I'll be in contact with base legal about next steps." He left. The door closed behind him with the soft sound of a well-maintained latch, which was somehow more final than a slam would have been. Waverly let out a slow breath. Caldwell looked at Pruitt. Something in her expression had changed in a way that was very small and would have been invisible to most people. A quality of reassessment, like a person updating a calculation they have been running. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Pruitt said. "He's going to come back through a different door." She nodded. She already knew that. "What I need to know," Pruitt said, "is what door he's likely to use." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That's a longer conversation." "I know," he said. "Tonight, my office, 1900. He thought about the 1994 incident for the rest of the afternoon. He had not thought about it in years, which was itself a kind of information. The things we stop thinking about are not always the things that have resolved. Sometimes they are the things that have simply been stored in the part of the mind that is quieter and darker, and does not announce itself unless something external forces the door. What had happened in 1994 was this. Pruitt had been stationed at a joint facility in North Carolina. He was 35 years old, a lieutenant colonel. It had been 3 years since Desert Storm, and he was in the particular professional phase of a military career where a man with his record could reasonably look ahead and see what the next decade was going to look like. There had been an inspector general investigation into contracting irregularities at the facility. Equipment invoiced and never delivered. Supply records that did not match physical inventory. The kind of discrepancy that in a civilian organization would have produced an audit and in a military organization produced, if handled correctly, not much of anything. Stoker had been a captain then. He had been assigned to the contracting office. The investigation had looked at him closely for a period of about 3 weeks, and then the focus had shifted elsewhere, and then the investigation had concluded with findings against 2 junior enlisted personnel and a recommendation for improved oversight procedures. Pruitt had been peripherally involved. He had been asked to provide a statement about the contracting process in his area, and he had provided it. He had not at the time connected what he knew about Stoker to what the investigation was looking for because the connection was not obvious and he had not been looking for it. He had made the connection later, much later, and he had done nothing with it because by then the moment had passed and because he had told himself with the language that experienced men use to make inaction sound like wisdom that incomplete information was not information at all and that acting on suspicion was not what responsible officers did. He thought about all of this while he walked the western perimeter of Iron Ridge in the late afternoon, which was something he did when he needed to think in a way that his office did not permit. The desert light at that hour was the color of old brass, and it fell across the installation at an angle that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. Or possibly exactly as significant as it was. He had enabled Stoker. Not through any action, but through the particular form of enabling that is the failure to disrupt. He had known something about the man for 30 years, and he had carried that knowledge the way you carry something in a coat pocket, something you stopped noticing precisely because you knew it was there and had decided its presence was not actionable. 30 years. He walked and he thought, and he came to the conclusion he had been approaching for the last 24 hours, which was that the moment he was in now was not actually a new moment. It was the moment he had been standing outside of for 30 years, waiting for a reason sufficient to walk through it. He thought about Rachel Caldwell, who was somewhere on the base at this moment, doing whatever a person with 25 years of classified service does when they are given an afternoon in which the most immediate threat has been temporarily redirected. He thought about what she carried, whatever it was. He did not yet know exactly what it was, but he knew it was substantial because it was in the quality of her stillness, the way a load-bearing wall is different from a decorative one, even when they look the same from the outside. He went to his office at 1850 and he waited. She arrived at exactly 1900 as he had expected she would. Waverly was with her, which Pruitt had not specifically invited but had not invited either, and which he understood as a statement about the current geometry of trust at Iron Ridge. Caldwell had identified Waverly as someone who could be in the room. That was information worth having. They sat. Pruitt did not offer coffee because the meeting was not that kind of meeting. He set his hands flat on the desk and he looked at the 2 people across from him and he said simply, "Tell me what you know, not what's in your file, what you actually know." Caldwell looked at him for a moment. Then she told them. September 2019, a mission with no official name and no official location, which is to say a mission that existed entirely in the space that the military maintains between what it does and what it records having done. 6 members of a SEAL element operating under orders, routed through a command structure that had been designated in the operational paperwork as Joint Task Force Oversight, which was a designation Caldwell had never encountered before and had not been able to find in any directory she had access to before or since. The mission involved a specific location, a compound in a region that she was not going to name in this room because the naming of it would not add anything useful and would cross a classification line she was not prepared to cross regardless of the context. They had been given a route, a specific approach vector timed to avoid a patrol schedule that the operational briefing presented as confirmed current intelligence. The road had been chosen precisely because it threaded between the 2 points of probable observation. They had taken the route. They had encountered not an absence of observation, but the opposite. They had walked into a situation that could only have existed if the patrol schedule they had been given was not the actual patrol schedule. The intelligence had not been outdated. It had not been an error of the kind that intelligence errors normally are. It had been wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when someone who knew the right answer provided the wrong one. Four of the six had died in the first 90 seconds. The fifth had died during the extraction. The sixth had been Caldwell. She said all of this without raising her voice. She said it with the particular quality of someone who has told this story before, not many times, but enough times to have found the way through it that cost the least without falsifying anything important. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Waverly had gone very still in the way that he went very still. Sometimes the stillness is of someone who has absorbed something and is letting it settle before it becomes the basis for anything else. Pruitt said, "September 2019. Can you give me a more specific date?" Caldwell looked at him. "September 14th. Something happened to Pruitt's face. It was a small thing. The kind of thing that would have been invisible to anyone who had not been paying close attention to his face for the preceding 2 days and had not developed in that time a working understanding of what its changes meant. Waverly caught it. Caldwell caught it. "Colonel," Waverly said. Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. "The contracting review at our sister installation," he said finally. "The one that started in August 2019 and was wrapped up by November." He looked at the wall, not at anything on the wall, through it at something in a different place and time. There was a name in the preliminary documents, an officer connected to the oversight designation that routed the operational orders for that kind of mission structure. I saw it because I was on the distribution list for interagency coordination, and the document came through without the name having been properly redacted yet. Caldwell was watching him. "I made a note of the name," Pruitt said, "and then the document was recalled and a corrected version was issued with the name blacked out. And I told myself I had seen something that I was not supposed to see, and that the appropriate thing was to treat it as if I had not seen it." He stopped. The room held the weight of what he had just said. "What was the name?" Caldwell asked. The question was quiet. It was the quietest thing she had said in the meeting, and it was the most consequential. Pruitt looked at her. "I think," he said slowly, "that before I tell you that name, I need to tell you something about what I did with it in 2003. He paused. "Or rather, what I didn't do." She waited. He told her about 2003, not in the way he had told Waverly, which was oblique and compressed. He told her the full shape of it, the tailing of a career officer whose decisions he had come to believe were not random, the accumulation of information that had reached the point of sufficiency, the moment in which he had faced the choice of what to do with it and had chosen with full knowledge of what he was choosing to do. Nothing. He told her that he had filed the documents in a personal archive and had not opened that archive in 21 years. He told her that the archive was in a fireproof box in the storage room of his house in Tucson. He told her that he thought the name in those documents and the name on the blacked-out 2019 document were the same name. And then he told her the name. It took a physical effort, not because the name was difficult to say, because saying it was the act that converted 30 years of carefully maintained inaction into something irreversible. Saying it was the point of no return, and he was 65 years old, and there was a retirement packet in his desk drawer, and part of him understood clearly that what was on the other side of this particular door was not a peaceful conclusion to a long career. He said it anyway. Caldwell was quiet for a long time after he said it. Waverly looked at her and then at Pruitt and then at the wall. "He's retired," Caldwell said. It was not a question. "Since 2021, Pruitt said, "and currently living in Scottsdale." He paused. 3 hours from here." The geography of it had a particular quality of irony that none of them commented on because it was not the kind of irony that produces anything useful. "The connection to Stoker," Caldwell said. "Stoker worked under him," Pruitt said, "between 1998 and 2002 at a posting in Virginia. Whatever Stoker knows and whatever Stoker has been protecting himself with since I got here, I think that's where it comes from." Caldwell looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "Holt is a problem," she said, "but he's not the actual problem." "No," Pruitt said. "Stoker is a mechanism," she said. "He's how the actual problem insulates itself." Yes, she absorbed this, not with surprise, with the quality of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already suspected but had needed corroboration for. "I need to make a call tonight," she said. "To who?" "Someone who monitors communication patterns around certain names." She paused. "If Stoker has been in contact with Scottsdale recently, that contact will be on record somewhere. I can find out if it is." Pruitt looked at her. He was thinking about the classification level of what she was describing. He was also thinking about Ezra Cobb and about September 14th, 2019, and about a fireproof box in his storage room in Tucson that he had not opened in 21 years. Make the call, he said. The next 48 hours at Iron Ridge had a surface calm that bore no relationship to what was moving underneath it. On the surface, Iron Ridge was a military installation processing the administrative aftermath of an incident involving Sergeant Victor Holt. Holt was on medical leave in a room in the base hospital wing that was not technically a restriction, but had the functional quality of one because the two people who normally enabled his movement around the installation were no longer willing to be seen in proximity to him. Danny Mace had undergone a kind of silent reorientation that was visible in the way he held himself in formation and the direction his eyes moved when Holt's name was mentioned. Not loyalty, not disloyalty. The particular neutrality of someone who has placed a bet and is waiting to see which way the outcome is moving. Stoker had submitted his administrative review request to base legal and was waiting for a response that was taking longer than he had expected because Pruitt had made certain informal communications to the legal office that were entirely within his authority as installation commander, and that had the effect of ensuring the response would be thorough and unhurried. Caldwell had made her call. Pruitt did not know exactly what she had said or to whom she had said it. He knew she had been in her quarters for 2 hours beginning at 2200 the night after their meeting, and that when she had emerged the following morning, she had the quality of someone who has received information that has organized other information into a new configuration. She did not tell him what the call had produced. Not immediately. He was coming to understand someone who did not share information until she had decided what the information meant and what sharing it would accomplish. This was not a withholding quality. It was a precision quality. She did not want to give him something that would require him to act before the acting made sense. He respected that. He was the same way. He had spent 37 years being that way, occasionally in the wrong direction, but consistently. On the 41st hour after their meeting in his office, she appeared at his door during the midday period when the command building was at its least populated. She sat down. She said, "Stoker has called the same number in Scottsdale 4 times in the last 9 days. 3 of the calls were in the 48 hours after I arrived." Pruitt sat with that. "The last call," she said, "was last night, after our meeting." The room was very quiet. Pruitt said, "He knows we've connected him. He knows something has changed," she said. "He may not know exactly what, but he knows enough to have made that call." Pruitt thought about what that meant for the timeline of whatever was going to happen next. He thought about administrative reviews and legal office timelines and the particular speed with which systems move when someone within them is trying to simultaneously protect themselves and maintain the appearance of due process. "He's going to move faster now," Pruitt said. "Yes," she said, "and he's not going to use the administrative process for the next move. That's too slow and too visible." "What's he going to use?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That's what I'm trying to determine. I have a contact who's looking at communication patterns for anything that moves in the direction of media." "Media. My identity," she said. "Ghost. If Stoker or someone he's connected to decides that the most efficient way to neutralize me is to make me a liability, rather than fight me directly, the tool they'd use is exposure. Classified identity. Burned in the press, I become a problem for the Navy to manage rather than an asset." Pruitt stared at her. He had understood in a general way that the stakes of the situation at Iron Ridge extended beyond the internal. He had understood it the way you understand something that has been framed for you abstractly. Sitting across from her now, with the specific and operational language she had just used, he understood it concretely for the first time. She had sources of her own in the field, people she had worked with, networks of trust built over 25 years in classified environments. If her identity was exposed, those networks did not just become unusable. They became dangerous to the people within them. "How many people?" he said. She shook her head slightly, not refusing to answer, indicating the answer was not a number she was going to say out loud in a room that had not been swept. It was enough. "When will you know?" he said. "By tonight," she said, "one way or another." She knew by 1700. She found Pruitt in the motor pool where he had been doing the thing he sometimes did when he needed to think without appearing to think, which was walking slowly around vehicles and looking at them as though he were conducting an informal inspection. It was a habit that gave him privacy in plain sight. People who saw a colonel inspecting vehicles did not approach him with questions. She fell into step beside him without preamble. "It's already happened," she said. He stopped walking. "Not published yet," she said, "but the information is in the hands of a reporter who covers defense contracting for a regional publication. She received an anonymous digital package 21 hours ago. It contained partial personnel records enough to identify Ghost as a real call sign associated with a real officer, and enough biographical detail to make the connection to my name possible with a moderate level of additional research. Pruitt was quiet. The motor pool smelled of fuel and hot metal. Somewhere behind them, two mechanics were talking about something in the low, unhurried way of people doing work that requires their hands but not their full attention. Holt, Pruitt said. Holt accessed a terminal he shouldn't have had access to, she said. 36 hours ago after the motor pool incident, before I could move to restrict his system access. The access log will show it, but the showing of it comes after the fact. Through Stoker, Pruitt said. Stoker gave him the access or knew about it, she said. Yes. Pruitt understood what this meant in legal terms. Unauthorized access to classified personnel information with intent to disclose. It was not an administrative infraction. It was a federal matter. It was the kind of thing that did not resolve through base legal offices and administrative reviews. It resolved through different channels entirely and at a level above Iron Ridge's command structure. He also understood what it meant in practical terms for the timeline. If the information was in the hands of a reporter and had been there for 21 hours, the window for containing it was not large. Reporters who received packages of this kind did not sit on them indefinitely. They verified. They consulted. They made decisions about publication based on factors that had nothing to do with what was convenient for the military. What do you need me to do? He said. She looked at him. The desert light was going bronze behind her, the late afternoon Arizona light that made everything look slightly more permanent than it was. I need you to call General Donovan, she said. It was the thing he had been avoiding saying out loud to himself all afternoon. He had known it since she said 21 hours ago. The moment she said 21 hours ago, he had understood that the situation had exceeded the boundary of what Iron Ridge could manage internally. He had known it, and he had spent the subsequent 4 minutes of this conversation walking toward it slowly, the way you walk towards something you have already decided to do, but have not yet fully accepted the cost of. General Frank Donovan was the commanding general of the broader installation network that included Iron Ridge. He was 2 levels above Pruitt. Calling him directly bypassing the intermediate command level was something that the chain of command existed precisely to prevent under normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances. Pruitt also knew something about Donovan that was not general knowledge at Iron Ridge. He knew that Donovan had been in 2019 one of 2 generals who had filed an internal dissent regarding the operational oversight structure that had been in place at the time of a certain mission in September of that year. The dissent had been classified. It had gone nowhere, but it existed. He knew that because the document had crossed his desk through a misdirected distribution in 2020, and he had read it before he realized it was not intended for him, and he had filed it in the same fireproof box in Tucson that contained the 2003 documents. He had never told anyone that. He told Caldwell now. She absorbed it. Her expression did not change in any large way, but something in the quality of her attention shifted the way a receiver shifts when the frequency it has been trying to locate suddenly becomes clear. Call him, she said, tonight. Pruitt nodded once. I should tell you something, she said. She was looking at the desert, at the scrubland, and the red rock at the edge of the installation property, at the enormous sky above it that was beginning to go from blue to the deep, almost purple that it gets in Arizona before full dark. I was told when I came here that this was a logistics assignment. That part was true in the sense that no one gave me a specific operational objective. She paused. But I knew about Stoker, not the full picture, a partial picture from a source I trust. I came here because I was told that if I came here, the picture would become fuller. She looked at him. I did not know about you. I did not know what you knew or what you'd been carrying. That part was not part of any calculation. Pruitt looked at her. He was thinking about the way things connect, not the way conspiracy theories connect things, which is with the false neatness of someone trying to make a picture that confirms what they already believe. The real way. The way that actual events connect, which is messily and partially and with long gaps between nodes where nothing visible is happening, but the underlying structure is nonetheless moving. And now, he said, now, she said, the picture is significantly fuller. He nodded. They stood there for a moment in the motor pool at Iron Ridge, Arizona, at 5:15 in the afternoon with the sound of the 2 mechanics behind them and the enormous desert sky above them, and the particular quality of a situation that has reached the point where the next action is the only action, and what matters is whether the person who needs to take it actually does. Pruitt reached for his phone. He stopped. The call, he said. If I make it, Donovan is going to move fast. The situation becomes federal. Holt Stoker, the exposure of your identity, all of it goes to a level where I'm not the controlling authority anymore. Yes, she said. I won't be able to manage the outcome from inside it. No, she said. That's what I should do anyway, he said. It was not a question. He was not looking for her confirmation. He was saying it out loud for the same reason that certain things need to be said out loud, because saying them completes the circuit between the decision and the action in a way that internal resolve sometimes cannot. She did not confirm it or deny it. She simply looked at him with the expression of someone who has already known for some time what the right answer is and has been waiting to see if the other person was going to arrive at it on their own terms. He dialed. The call connected on the third ring. "General Donovan," said the voice on the other end, crisp, alert. The voice of someone who has been in the military long enough that they are alert in the same way at all hours. "This is Colonel Harlan Pruitt at Iron Ridge," Pruitt said. "Sir, I need to speak with you about a situation that has reached a threshold requiring your direct attention. Tonight, if possible." A pause. Not a long one. "Go ahead, Colonel." "Not on this line, sir," Pruitt said, "and not briefly." Another pause. The kind that a man makes when he is assessing the weight of what has just been put in front of him. "I'll have my aide contact you within the hour for a secure connection." "Thank you, sir." "Pruitt," Donovan said, one word, but it had a quality to it that said the general understood something about the nature of the call that had not been stated. "Yes, sir. Whatever it is, you did the right thing calling." The call ended. Pruitt lowered the phone. The desert around Iron Ridge was going dark now, the particular desert darkness that is not the absence of light but the presence of a different kind of it, the stars beginning to assert themselves above the dim glow of the installation's perimeter lighting. The air had cooled. It smelled of creosote and the faint metallic cold that the Arizona desert produces after sundown, as though the ground is releasing what the day put into it. He stood in the motor pool with his phone in his hand, and he felt for the first time in a very long time like a man who had walked through a door he had been standing outside for 37 years. It did not feel the way he had imagined it would feel. He had imagined in the few times over the decades that he had allowed himself to imagine it, that it would feel large, momentous, the way that significant things are supposed to feel. It felt instead like the simple and irreversible completion of a thing that had needed to be completed for a very long time. Caldwell was watching him. "When he gets here," Pruitt said, "there are things he's going to want to know that only you can tell him." "I know," she said. "Are you ready for that?" She looked at the dark desert for a moment. Then she looked at him with the ice blue eyes that gave away only what she chose to give away, and she said, "I've been ready since September 14th, 2019. She walked back toward the command building. Pruitt stood alone in the motor pool. Behind him, the two mechanics had finished for the evening, and the space was quiet. Around him, Iron Ridge continued its nighttime operations. The perimeter lights, the distant sound of a vehicle somewhere on the eastern side of the installation, the flag moving slightly in a wind that was just barely perceptible. He thought about a fireproof box in a storage room in Tucson. He thought about the weight of what was in it and the weight of what had been required to carry it, and the different weight lighter and heavier at the same time of what it was going to mean to finally set it down. He thought about a 22-year-old private named Ezra Cobb and about 5 members of a SEAL element who had died on September 14th, 2019 because the information they trusted had been deliberately wrong. He thought about Rachel Caldwell walking into Iron Ridge with a single duffel bag and no ceremony, and about what it had taken to produce a person who could carry what she was carrying and still walk the way she walked. He thought about what it meant to be 65 years old and still capable of choosing when the choice finally presented itself in a form that was impossible to defer. Then he put his phone in his pocket, and he walked back toward the command building through the Arizona night under the stars that were there all along, waiting to be seen by anyone who had finally stopped looking away. The Weight of Iron Ridge, Part 3. The truth doesn't retire. General Frank Donovan arrived at Iron Ridge before anyone expected him. The secure call the night before had lasted 47 minutes. Pruitt had given him the architecture of it, not every detail, but enough. The exposure of a classified identity, the unauthorized system access, the connection to a retired flag officer in Scottsdale, the pattern of protected behavior that had been running at Iron Ridge for longer than Pruitt had been its commanding officer, the documents in a fireproof box in Tucson that had been sitting there for 21 years. Donovan had listened without interrupting, which was itself information about the kind of man he was. When Pruitt finished, Donovan had asked 4 questions. They were precise questions, the kind that reveal not just what the asker wants to know, but what the asker already understands about the shape of the thing being described. He had asked them, and he had received the answers, and then he had said in a tone that was neither alarmed nor dismissive, but simply operational, that he would be at Iron Ridge by 0600. He arrived at 0542. Pruitt was at the gate when the vehicle came through. A single black SUV, government plates moving at the speed of something that had been traveling through the night. It stopped. Donovan got out. He was 61 years old, lean, in the way that some men stay lean when the discipline that produced it has become structural rather than effortful. He had white hair cropped close to his head and the face of someone who had spent 4 decades making decisions that other people had to live with. He looked at Pruitt across the roof of the vehicle in the gray light of the Arizona pre-dawn. "Colonel," he said. "Sir," said Pruitt, "thank you for coming." Donovan looked at the installation around them. He had the quality which Pruitt had noted in the few previous interactions he had had with him, of someone who reads a room not with his eyes, but with something underneath his eyes, taking the temperature of a place through some accumulated and automatic process of assessment. "Brief me on the way in," Donovan said. "I want to see Commander Caldwell by 6:30. They met in Pruitt's office. Donovan, Pruitt, Caldwell, Waverly. The 4 of them around Pruitt's desk in the pale early light coming through the window, the kind of meeting that does not have an agenda because the situation is the agenda. Donovan looked at Caldwell for a moment before he said anything to her. The look of a man confirming something he had already decided. "Commander Caldwell," he said, "I've read the accessible portions of your file. I'm aware that the accessible portions are a small fraction of the whole." "Yes, sir," she said. "I'm going to tell you something that is not in any file," he said. He said it in the same tone he used for everything else, which was the tone of a man who had long ago decided that clarity was more useful than comfort. "In the fall of 2019, I co-filed an internal dissent regarding the oversight structure that governs certain classified operational frameworks. The dissent was classified. It was filed with the Inspector General's office, and it went nowhere. But it is on record." Caldwell was very still. "I filed it," he said, "because I had reason to believe that the command architecture in place at that time was susceptible to a specific kind of contamination, the kind where an individual with enough seniority and enough accumulated institutional cover could route decisions through structures that looked legitimate from the outside and were not." He paused. "I did not know at the time about the specific events of September 2019. I learned about them later, partially, through channels that themselves required careful handling." He looked at her directly. "I am telling you this," he said, "because what Colonel Pruitt described to me last night suggests that we are looking at the same structure from a different angle. And because you deserve to know that you are not walking into this room as someone whose account needs to be established. You are walking into it as someone whose account is already partially corroborated by a source that predates your arrival at this installation by 5 years." The room was quiet. Caldwell looked at Donovan for a long moment with those ice blue eyes that gave away only what she decided to give away. Then she said very quietly, "September 14th. "Yes," he said, "that was all. It was enough." The first thing Donovan did at 0658 was call the base legal officer and the installation security chief simultaneously and issue 2 instructions. The first instruction was to place Sergeant Victor Holt on formal restriction to the medical wing pending federal-level review of unauthorized access to classified systems. Not an administrative measure, a security measure. The language was specific, and the authority behind it was 2 levels above Iron Ridge, and the legal officer understood what that meant in terms of the range of challenge available to anyone who wanted to contest it, which was essentially none. The second instruction was to place Major Glenn Stoker's office quarters and personal vehicle under immediate evidence, hold pending a joint review by the Installation Inspector General, and subject to the next several hours of development, potentially the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Stoker was notified at 0715. Pruitt was not present for that notification, but Waverly was, because Waverly had been asked to accompany the security chief as a witness, and Waverly described it afterward in the careful language of someone who understood the significance of what they had observed. Stoker had been in his office when they arrived. He was sitting behind his desk. He had the look of a man who had spent the night arriving at conclusions he did not welcome. When the security chief read the hold order, Stoker did not object. He did not protest or produce the smooth procedural language he normally deployed in these moments. He sat very still, and he looked at the hold order, and then he looked at the wall, and what passed across his face in that moment was not the recalibration of a man revising of his strategy. It was something older and quieter. The expression of a man who has been moving away from a thing for a very long time and has just discovered that the distance he thought he had accumulated does not exist. He asked one question: "Is Donovan here personally?" The security chief confirmed that he was. Stoker nodded once. He stood and he placed his hands behind his back, and he waited to be escorted out of his own office with the bearing of a man who had decided that the one thing left to him was the appearance of composure. It was, Waverly said afterward, one of the stranger things he had seen in 20 years of service. Holt did not receive the news with composure. He received it at 0740 in the medical wing, where he had been since the motor pool incident, occupying a room that had the functional quality of a restriction without the formal designation of one. The attending corpsman delivered the hold order at the direction of the security chief, and Holt read it and then looked up and then made a decision that was consistent with every other decision he had made over the preceding 48 hours, which is to say was driven entirely by the part of him that had never learned the difference between momentum and direction. He attempted to leave the medical wing. He made it approximately 40 feet. Captain Declan Waverly was in the corridor. He was not there by accident. Pruitt had positioned him there at 0730 because Pruitt had been watching Victor Holt for 8 months, and he understood how Holt processed information that threatened him, which was with forward movement and the conviction that size and velocity were sufficient responses to any situation. Waverly was 5 feet 11 inches tall and 180 pounds, which was considerably less than Holt, and he was standing in the middle of the corridor with his hands loose at his sides and the expression of someone who has already finished the calculation and is simply waiting for the other person to finish theirs. Holt stopped. There were 2 security personnel behind Waverly, not threatening, just present. Waverly looked at Holt for a moment. "Sergeant," he said, "there's nowhere to go." It was not a taunt. It was not a challenge. It was the simple and specific statement of a man informing another man of a fact. Holt stood in the corridor for a long moment, with his chest moving and his jaw set in the particular quality of a man who is running out of things to convert his anger into. Then slowly something in his posture changed. Not broke, changed. The way a storm changes when it runs out of the atmospheric conditions that produced it. The energy was still there, but it had nowhere to go. He turned and walked back to his room. Waverly watched him go. Later, when he described the moment to Pruitt, he said it was the first time in his observation of Holt that the man had made a decision based on an accurate reading of the actual situation rather than the situation he preferred to believe he was in. He said it with the tone of someone noting something that was in its small way almost interesting. By midday, Iron Ridge had been briefed, not in a formal assembly. Donovan did not do formal assemblies for this kind of thing because formal assemblies convert information into performance, and performance is rarely useful when the goal is clarity. What he did instead was direct the command staff to communicate specific and accurate information through their respective chains, and to do it in the same language he had used in his own communications, which was direct and specific, and did not include any of the hedging or procedural softening that these things normally accumulated as they traveled down a hierarchy. The information was this: Sergeant Victor Holt was on formal restriction pending federal-level review. The restriction was not subject to internal challenge. The matter was outside the administrative process of Iron Ridge. Major Glenn Stoker had been removed from his duties pending investigation. The nature of the investigation was not specified, but the level of authority behind the removal made its seriousness evident to anyone who understood how these designations worked. Commander Rachel Caldwell's assignment at Iron Ridge was confirmed, and her status was not under administrative review of any kind. The review request filed by Stoker had been withdrawn from the legal office by order of the commanding authority, which was now General Donovan. The base received this information with the particular efficiency of a place that has been holding its breath and has been given permission to exhale, not celebration. The people at Iron Ridge were not celebrating. They were too professional for that and too aware that what had happened was not a victory in any clean sense, but a correction. And corrections of this magnitude meant that something had been wrong long enough to require a correction of this magnitude, which was not a comfortable thing to absorb, even when the correction itself was correct. But there was the quality of a window being opened. Again. And this time the air that came through it felt like it had somewhere to go. Danny Mace Pruitt was told by the security chief in a brief and almost parenthetical note, had voluntarily gone to the legal office that morning and provided a written statement. The statement covered 14 months of observation. It was specific, detailed, and signed. He had done it before the restrictions on Holt and Stoker were even announced, which meant he had done it in the window, when the outcome was still genuinely uncertain, and the personal cost of the statement was real. Pruitt thought about that for a moment. He thought about what it meant for a 23-year-old corporal who had been performing loyalty to a man like Holt to walk into a legal office on his own initiative with 14 months of documented observation. He thought about the fact that something had made that possible. He thought he knew what it was. At 1400 hours, Donovan asked to meet with Caldwell and Pruitt together. They gathered in the conference room, which was the same conference room B where Stoker had held his administrative hearing 2 days earlier. The room had not changed. The fluorescent lights were the same. The slightly too large table was the same. But the quality of the air in it was entirely different, the way a room is different after the thing it was being used to contain has been removed. Donovan sat at the head of the table. He had a folder in front of him that Pruitt had not seen before. The documents from Stoker's office, Donovan said, have been transferred to a federal evidence hold. The preliminary review of his communications, including his personal devices, is consistent with what you described, Pruitt. Contact with a specific number in the Scottsdale area on 9 occasions in the past 30 days. 3 of those contacts occurred in the 48 hours following Commander Caldwell's arrival at Iron Ridge. He opened the folder. There is a name in these communications, he said. It appears in text form in 2 messages sent from Stoker's personal device to the Scottsdale number. It is not the name of the Scottsdale number's registered owner, which is a shell arrangement. It is a reference, an oblique one, but readable. He looked at Caldwell. I need to know, he said, if the name I am about to show you is consistent with what you and Colonel Pruitt discussed last night. He turned the folder and slid it across the table. Caldwell looked at it. She was still for a long moment. The particular stillness that Pruitt had come to understand was not the absence of response, but the controlled presence of one. The stillness of a person allowing something significant to arrive without letting it move them before they were ready to be moved. Then she looked up. Yes, she said. Her voice was level, entirely level, with the specific quality of something that has been maintained at a consistent setting for a very long time. Donovan looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the folder. He had not needed to look at it to know what name was in it. He had known the name for 21 years. He had kept it in a fireproof box and told himself that incomplete information was not information, and that acting on suspicion was not what responsible officers did. He had maintained that position with considerable discipline across 2 decades. Looking at it now, written in the cold specificity of evidence, was different from carrying it as something internal and deferrable. Colonel Pruitt, Donovan said, you indicated last night that you have documentary material in your personal archive that may be relevant. Yes, sir. I need that material. I'll drive to Tucson tonight, Pruitt said. I can have it in your hands by 0800 tomorrow. Donovan nodded. Then he did something that Pruitt had not expected. He set down the folder and he looked at Pruitt for a moment with the expression of someone who has something to say that exists outside the operational frame of the meeting. How long have you been carrying it? He said. Pruitt understood what he was asking. Not about the documents, about the weight of them. 21 years, he said. Donovan was quiet for a moment. I've been carrying something similar for 5, he said. Different material, same essential shape. He paused. I want you to know that what you did last night, making that call, providing that account, is not a small thing. It may not feel like what it is from inside it. These things rarely do. But I want it on record, even if the record is just this room, that I understand what it cost. Pruitt said nothing. There was nothing to say to that which would have been accurate and not excessive. He simply nodded once in the way that men of a certain generation and a certain background acknowledge things that have weight without performing the acknowledgement. Caldwell was looking at the window. Donovan turned to her. The exposure of your identity, he said, the material that reached the reporter. I've been in contact with a source who monitors these situations, she said. The reporter received the package but has not published. The package contained enough to suggest a direction, but not enough to establish the connection independently. If we move quickly, the classified material can be formally redesignated in a way that makes publication legally untenable before the verification window closes. How quickly? 48 hours, she said. I'll have legal counsel file the emergency redesignation order this afternoon, Donovan said. The reporter will receive formal notification through counsel tonight. Caldwell nodded. Then she said, there are people outside this country whose safety depends on that material staying buried. I know, Donovan said. I need to know, she said, that the process of this investigation, whatever it becomes, is not going to produce disclosures that go beyond what's operationally necessary. I will personally oversee the disclosure parameters, Donovan said. He said it in the tone of someone making a commitment rather than offering a reassurance which is a different thing and which Caldwell appeared to recognize as such. She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. It was, Pruitt thought, the first time since he had met her that she had said something that sounded like trust. Not blind trust, calibrated trust. The kind that has examined the person it is being extended toward and found them sufficient for the specific purpose. He understood the magnitude of that in the context of what she had been through and what it had cost her to be in this room at all. The formal separation proceedings for Holt were initiated at 1600 hours. They were held in the administrative building in the larger briefing room rather than conference room B, and Donovan presided over them himself, which was unusual for a matter at this level and which communicated without anything needing to be said about it the weight of authority behind the proceedings. Holt was brought in by the security chief and two personnel from the military police attachment. He was in his uniform. His shoulder was still in the soft brace. He looked like a man who had arrived at a place he had been moving toward for a long time without understanding that he was moving toward it. The charges were read: unauthorized access to classified personnel systems, intent to disclose classified information to an unauthorized recipient, physical assault of a superior officer, creating a hostile command environment through conduct unbecoming. The list was specific and documented and supported by the signed statements of 22 witnesses and the access logs from the terminal Holt had used 36 hours earlier. Holt sat through the reading with a stillness that was different from any stillness Pruitt had seen from him before. It was not the controlled stillness of composure. It was the stillness of someone who has finally run out of the energy that produced the motion. When the reading was finished, Donovan looked at him. "You have the right to respond," Donovan said. "Whatever you say will be included in the formal record." Holt looked at their table in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked up, not at Donovan, but across the room to where Caldwell was sitting at the far end of the table. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that Pruitt could not fully read and did not try to. Then he looked back at the table. "No response," he said. It was the most honest thing Victor Holt had said since he arrived at Iron Ridge. Perhaps longer. Donovan stated the formal outcome: effective separation from service pending court-martial proceedings on the federal charges. Transfer to federal custody pending the result of those proceedings. All existing benefits and designations suspended during the pendency. The security chief and the military police personnel escorted Holt out of the room. No one spoke for a moment after the door closed. Then Waverly, who was sitting 3 seats from Pruitt, said very quietly to no one in particular, "That took about 2 years too long." It was the kind of thing that would have been insubordinate in other circumstances. In these circumstances, it was simply accurate, and no one in the room treated it as anything else. At 1800 hours, Pruitt drove to Tucson. The drive took 43 minutes on the I-10 at that hour, when the worst of the afternoon traffic had cleared and the desert on either side of the highway had gone from the harsh clarity of full daylight to something softer and more ambiguous. He drove in the particular silence that he preferred for long thought, which was no music and no radio, just the sound of the road and the engine and the increasingly dark sky above the Mesa country. He had been making this drive for 14 months back and forth between Iron Ridge and the house in Tucson where he had lived since his wife Margaret died in 2020. The house was a 1-story adobe on the east side, 3 bedrooms that were now used for sleeping storage and a second storage that he called his study. Margaret had loved the house because of the mountain view from the kitchen window. He had kept the house because it was the place that still felt most like a place where something good had happened, even with her gone from it. He thought about her on the drive. He did not always let himself do that. There was a version of grief that he had developed in the 4 years since her death that was functional and sustainable, which involved allowing certain thoughts access during certain hours and keeping others contained. It was the same mechanism he had applied to Fort Bragg and to 2003 and to the fireproof box in the storage room. The management of weight through careful allocation of when and how much of it you carry at a time. He thought about what she would have said about tonight. Margaret Pruitt had been a woman of considerable and precise intelligence, which she had applied throughout their 41-year marriage primarily to understanding what her husband was not saying, which had kept her very busy. She had known about Fort Bragg without being told the specifics because she knew him well enough to understand the shape of what he was not telling her. She had known about 2003 the same way. She had never pressed. She had understood with the specific understanding of someone who has spent 4 decades married to a man who processes things slowly and privately, that pressing was not the mechanism. What she had said once in the context of something entirely different was this. They had been sitting on the back porch in the evening, and he could not remember now what they had been talking about, but she had looked at him in the way she sometimes did, the way that meant she was saying something that looked like a passing comment but was not, and she had said, the things you carry that you shouldn't be carrying don't get lighter over time. They get heavier. That's not because of what they are. It's because of what you know they are. He had not responded to that at the time. He thought about it often. He turned off the highway and drove through the east side and pulled into the driveway of the adobe house at 7:18. The porch light was on because he always left it on when he was going to be returning in the dark. A habit from before Margaret died. He had not changed it. He went inside. He did not stop in any of the rooms. He went directly to the storage room at the back of the house, which smelled of old paper and the particular dry closeness of a room that is not opened frequently. He turned on the overhead light. Against the far wall behind two boxes of Margaret's books that he had not been able to bring himself to donate and had not been able to bring himself to open was the fireproof box. It was gray. Standard commercial issue. The kind sold at office supply stores for the protection of important documents. The combination was a date he would not have been able to explain to anyone who asked, because it was a date he had chosen precisely because it would mean something to him and nothing to anyone else. He opened it. Inside were 3 folders, each one labeled in his own handwriting in the compressed and precise script he had developed during decades of writing things that needed to be legible later. He lifted them out and set them on the floor in the order they had been filed, and he looked at them in the storage room light. The first contained the documents from the 1994 Inspector General Review. His own annotated copy with the handwritten margins where he had made connections that the official document did not make and then kept to himself. The second contained materials from 2003, the accumulated observations, the timeline, the name written in his own handwriting at the top of the second page, underlined once. He had not underlined it for emphasis. He had underlined it because writing it had been an act that required a physical marker to make it feel real, and underlining was the marker he had chosen. The third folder was the one he had not opened in longer than the others. It contained a single document. 4 pages, the misdirected distribution from 2020, Donovan's Descent. The pages were slightly yellowed at the edges in the way that paper yellows when it has been stored in conditions that are protective but not climate controlled. He looked at it without removing it from the folder. He closed the fireproof box. He picked up the 3 folders. He carried them to the kitchen table, and he sat down in the chair that had been his chair for 22 years, the one on the side of the table that looked toward the mountain view that Margaret had loved. The mountains were not visible at night, but he knew where they were, and looking in that direction had become a form of looking at her. He sat there for a while. He was 65 years old. He had 36 years in the United States military. He had made a great many decisions in that time, some of them well and some of them poorly, and some of them in the category that resists evaluation because the full set of their consequences had not yet come in. Tonight, he was going to drive back to Iron Ridge with these folders, and he was going to place them in the hands of General Frank Donovan, who would place them in the hands of the federal investigators who were already beginning the process of building a case around a name that had been underlined on the second page of the middle folder for 21 years. And after that, what happened would happen outside of his control. He sat with that for a moment, the particular quality of it. The thing that had kept him from moving for so long was not primarily fear, though there had been fear. It was the unwillingness to surrender control of an outcome that he could only surrender by acting on incomplete information toward an uncertain result. He had told himself that this was wisdom. He had told himself this so many times and for so long that he had stopped examining whether it was true. What he understood now, sitting at Margaret's kitchen table in the east side of Tucson with 3 folders in front of him, was that it had not been wisdom. It had been the most sophisticated form of the same impulse that had kept Dale Whitmore's complaint from going anywhere. The impulse to protect the equilibrium of the system you are inside, to prioritize the stability of the structure over the cost being paid by the individuals the structure was supposed to protect. 5 people, September 14th, 2019. He had not known about them when they happened. He could not have prevented them. But the information he had been carrying since 2003 might have produced, if acted upon a different configuration of authority in 2019, that would have made what happened to them less possible. He did not know that. He would never know it. The counterfactual was genuinely beyond recovery. What he knew was that Ezra Cobb was 58 years old in a world where he was actually 22 and dead, and that 5 members of Rachel Caldwell's element were dead, and that the man whose name was on the second page of the middle folder was living in Scottsdale, Arizona, 3 hours from Iron Ridge, in whatever quality of peace a man like that is capable of living in. He stood up, he picked up the folders, he carried them to the car, and he drove back to Iron Ridge through the Arizona night, through the dark desert and the enormous sky, and the road that had been there all along, waiting to take him wherever he finally decided he was going. He placed the folders in Donovan's hands at 0914 the following morning. Donovan received them without ceremony and placed them in a secure evidence bag that his aide had waiting. He looked at Pruitt for a moment. "The federal team arrives at 1400, he said. "They'll want to speak with you." "I'll be available," Pruitt said. And after that, Pruitt understood what he was asking. The retirement packet in his desk drawer, the question of what came next for a man of 65 who had just made a decision that closed one version of his future and opened another that was not yet defined. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. Donovan accepted that. "Take the time you need." The federal investigators arrived at 1358. There were 4 of them, 2 from the FBI and 2 from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, and they brought with them the particular quality of authority that exists when the investigation is being taken seriously at a level that exceeds the immediate geography of the problem. Pruitt spoke with them for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He was specific and he was complete, and he did not omit anything that was in the folders or anything that was in his memory that was relevant to what the folders contained. He told them about 1994 and about 2003 and about the misdirected distribution in 2020. He told them about Stoker and about the pattern of protection that had predated his arrival at Iron Ridge. He told them about the 4 calls and the 9 contacts and the timing of the communication with the Scottsdale number relative to Caldwell's arrival. He told them the name, which they already had from the folders and from Stoker's communications. But there is a difference between a name that exists in documents and a name that is spoken aloud by a person who has been carrying it for 21 years, and the investigators understood that difference, and they received both with equal seriousness. When the interview was finished, one of the FBI agents, a woman in her 40s named Briggs, who had the look of someone who had been doing this long enough to have stopped being surprised by most things, looked at him across the table and said, "Colonel, I want to be clear about something. The material you've provided today in combination with what we've gathered from other sources represents a significant advance in an investigation that has been building for some time. Your cooperation has materially affected the capacity of this investigation to proceed effectively." Pruitt looked at her. "I should have done it 21 years ago," he said. She did not disagree with that. She did not offer the comfortable reframe that it was done now and that was what mattered. She simply looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard many people in many situations say the version of that sentence that applies to them and who understands that the hearing of it is part of what the moment requires. "Yes," she said, "probably." He respected her for that. Stoker, facing the full weight of what had been assembled against him, retained a lawyer by late afternoon and said nothing further to anyone at Iron Ridge. He was transferred to federal custody the following morning, and his departure from the installation was witnessed by almost no one because it happened at 0500 before the base had fully come to operational day. The name in Scottsdale, the name that was underlined on the second page of Pruitt's folder, was known to the investigators within 48 hours. Pruitt was not present for what happened after that. It was no longer his investigation to be present for. He had provided what he had, and he had been thanked for it in the formal and impersonal language of a process that was now larger than him, and that was correct. That was how it was supposed to work. The individual contributing to a system that had the scale and authority to do what needed to be done. The problem was when the system did not work, which was when the individual contribution became essential. And the problem with essential individual contributions was that they required the individual to have been paying attention and to have been willing to act on what they saw. He had paid attention for 37 years. The willing to act part had taken longer. He thought about that during the days that followed. He thought about it on the long walks he took in the early morning around the perimeter of Iron Ridge in the cold Arizona air before the sun came up enough to make the heat. He thought about the gap between knowing and doing, and about how large a gap it was possible to maintain, and about what it cost to maintain it. Not the cost to the person maintaining it, which was something he had thought about a great deal and was now less interested in. The cost to the people on the other side of what the gap protected. He thought about Dale Whitmore and Ezra Cobb and 6 people in a SEAL element in September 2019. He thought about Rachel Caldwell walking into Iron Ridge with one bag and no ceremony carrying something she should not have had to carry alone for 5 years. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who saw things clearly and acted on them promptly, and whether he had ever been that person, and whether it was possible to become that person at 65, or whether 65 was simply too late for the becoming, and the most that was available was the doing, which was a different thing, but perhaps sufficient. He decided it was sufficient. He pulled the retirement packet from the drawer. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put it back. Caldwell came to his office on the fourth morning after Donovan's arrival. She knocked once with the back of two knuckles, precise. She came in and she sat in the chair across from his desk, and she set her hands in her lap and she looked at him with those ice blue eyes in the particular way that she had, which was the way of someone who was deciding how much of something to show. She said, "Donovan told me this morning about the position." Pruitt nodded. She had been briefed the previous day about the intelligence unit, a new threat analysis structure operating under the authority of Donovan's command, focused specifically on the kind of internal vulnerability that had produced the situation at Iron Ridge and the situation of September 2019. Not a combat role, an intelligence role, analysis and assessment in the building of frameworks for identifying the conditions under which what had happened could happen again. The position had been offered to her. "What did you tell him?" Pruitt said. "I told him I needed a day," she said, and now she was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window at the parade ground visible through it, where the morning formation was moving through its sequences with the regularity of something that continues regardless of what surrounds it. "I came here to stop," she said. "I want to be clear about that. It was not performance. It was not modesty. 25 years of what I have done produces a particular kind of exhaustion that is not physical. I wanted to be somewhere where the primary risk of the day was bureaucratic inconvenience." "I know," Pruitt said. "What I did not expect," she said, "was to find that the somewhere I came to was carrying the same thing I had been carrying in a different form and in a different person." She paused. "I did not expect Colonel Harlan Pruitt." Pruitt said nothing. "The position Donovan is describing," she said, "is not what I came here for. But it is the thing that is directly connected to the people I lost, and to the reason that I came here at all." She looked at him. "I don't know how to walk away from it. I've been trying to find the logic of walking away from it for 24 hours, and I cannot construct it." "Then don't walk away from it," Pruitt said. She looked at him for a moment. "It's not going to be quiet," she said. "The investigation will produce things that require response. The people connected to that name in Scottsdale will not simply accept the outcome. There will be complications." "There usually are," Pruitt said. She nodded once, very slowly. "I'll accept the position," she said. She stood. At the door she paused. She had the quality of someone who is about to say something they have been considering whether to say. "For what it's worth," she said, "what you did. The call to Donovan, the folders, what it took to do those things after 21 years. She looked at him with the expression she reserved for things that mattered to her in a way she was not going to fully perform. "I want you to know that I understand what it was." She left. Pruitt sat with the empty office. He looked at the parade ground through the window, at the flag moving in the morning wind, at the formation below men and women in the early light of another Iron Ridge day, going about the business of the thing they had chosen to do. He thought about what she had said. He thought about the understanding she had extended to him, the specific and earned understanding of someone who had also spent a very long time carrying something that should have been set down sooner. The solidarity of people who have finally done the thing they could have done earlier and have to live with the distance between when they could have and when they did, and have found that living with it is possible, which is not the same as it's being comfortable. He opened his desk drawer. He looked at the retirement packet. He closed the drawer. He was 65 years old and there was work to do. Via Clinic, Tucson, Arizona, 2024. The waiting room was the same, the fluorescent lights, the chairs with their particular institutional quality. The sound of the HVAC and the occasional murmur of a conversation from behind the intake desk, and the specific silence that is not peaceful, but is at least honest about what it is. Harlan Pruitt sat in the same chair he always sat in, with his back against the wall, with the black and white composition notebook on his knee. The notebook was nearly full now. He could feel it in the weight of it and in the resistance of the pages when he opened it. He closed it. He had been writing for 3 months, not continuously. In the mornings, mostly before Iron Ridge came fully operational for the day. At his desk, with the coffee from the thermos that had been his since Desert Storm, in the particular early quiet that the base had before the day's activity began. He had written the whole shape of it. The arc from before Caldwell arrived to after. The things he had known and the things he had done with the knowing. The people who had been affected by the distance between those two things. He had not written it to explain himself. He had written it because there is a category of truth that requires the act of writing to become fully visible, even to the person who already knows it. The act of forming it into words that could be read by someone else forces a specificity and a completeness that internal knowledge does not require. Internal knowledge can remain approximate. Written truth cannot. The truth written out was the size it was. He looked at the cover of the notebook. He looked at his hands holding it. The hands of a 65-year-old man who had spent a long time in a profession that required them to be useful. Loretta at the intake desk looked up at him. She had been watching him since he came in. She did it every time he came in for his quarterly appointment, which was 4 times now. She had the quality of someone who has become interested in a story and is watching for the next chapter. "Colonel Pruitt," she said, "Dr. Navarro will see you now." He stood. He tucked the notebook under his arm. She looked at it. "Is that the one you've been writing in?" "Yes," he said. "Are you done?" He thought about that for a moment. Whether done was the right word for what the notebook was. "Done recording," he said, "not done with what it's about." She nodded with the expression of someone who understands more of what that means than the words on their surface. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. He had been thinking about that for the last 3 weeks since he wrote the final entry. Since the federal proceedings against the name in Scottsdale had moved into a phase where the documentary evidence would need to be supplemented by personal testimony from individuals who had direct knowledge of the pattern of behavior it described. Since the Senate Armed Services Committee had opened its own inquiry into the oversight structures that had made the events of September 2019 possible. Since Waverly had called him from Iron Ridge the previous week and said that Caldwell had asked about him, which was not the kind of thing Caldwell did casually and which he had thought about every day since. "I'm going to submit it," he said, "to the Senate inquiry as a personal account for the record." Loretta looked at him. "It should have been written 37 years ago," he said, "but it wasn't. It's written now." He paused. "A promise doesn't have an expiration date, neither does the truth." He walked toward the hallway door. The door opened onto the corridor that led to the examination rooms, which were painted the institutional green of 1,000 government interiors and smelled of antiseptic and the particular warm recycled air of a building that is maintained at a consistent temperature regardless of what the weather is doing outside. He walked through. Behind him, the door closed on the waiting room and its particular silence. The fluorescent lights, the chairs, the sound of an HVAC system doing its job. Outside through the windows that faced east, the Arizona morning was doing what it always did, without apology, without ceremony. The light coming down from a sky that was enormous and indifferent and full of a clarity that the desert has in the early hours that is available to anyone who is looking in the right direction. He was 65 years old. He had 36 years behind him and whatever was ahead of him. He walked down the corridor toward the examination room with the notebook under his arm and the morning light through the windows in the specific quality of a man who has set down something heavy and is discovering in the first moments of not carrying it that his hands are free, that it is not too late, that it was never too late, that the only question and the only question that has ever mattered is whether you are going to act on what you know when the moment is in front of you or whether you are going to add it to the collection of things you carry and call the carrying wisdom. He had carried for 37 years. He had set it down. The corridor was long and the light was good, and at the end of it, the next thing was waiting. He kept walking.